Hello again, it's Don Simpson, the Chief Explorer of the Innovation Expedition, sharing stories with you from my global odyssey, a global search for cross-cultural harmony and high performance. And today's story is the third out of Logbook 3, and in case you are unaware, Logbook 3 is telling the story of how I connected with the African diaspora in Canada and began to come to grips with the roots of racism. And tonight's story is excerpt 19, which focuses on planning my thesis on Canadian Black history, which, if you've heard the last two experts know, came out of my experience in the community of Buxton, Ontario, and its commitment to building a first major museum of Black history. So one thing became clear to me about this oral history initiative I was starting to undertake in the mid-1960s, and that was that I had a responsibility to the museum team in Buxton to package the historical findings into a resource that would support their dream. It was also time for me to think in earnest about my PhD thesis, and I had begun to think that my volunteer efforts in the Buxton community might provide me with a theme for a PhD thesis. And if I handled it well, my thesis could then provide important support for the museum. And by this time, my historical focus had broadened to include an interest in all the Black communities in what was known as Upper Canada and later became Ontario. So I began writing my thesis proposal, and my intent was to provide context and fill a significant gap in the literature by beginning with a survey of the development of all Black communities in Ontario from the province's birth in 1791 to 1870, just after the American Civil War. That period would include the large-scale immigration of Blacks to Ontario following the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in the U.S. in 1850, and would conclude a few years after the American Civil War, when many of these immigrants returned to the United States, having realized that they were still very American in the sense that they had all left family members there. I was very interested in the role played by the education system in integrating Black immigrants into their new communities in Upper Canada. And my definition of the education system went far beyond a focus just on schools to include the roles of churches, extended families, community groups, the press, private clubs, and societies. Indeed, every socializing agency in the community who might play a role in helping people both to learn to cope in a new environment and formulate a philosophy of life that would enable them to thrive in it. Since the attitude and aspirations of the Blacks were highly influenced by the attitude of the white community towards them, the education of whites on such topics as slavery was also included in my scope. For two reasons then, I was determined to cover each of the over 100 communities that grew up in this area during the period, rather than focusing on just a few of the larger ones. First, I felt that the latter approach would have distorted the reality experienced by many Black immigrants at the time. But secondly was the fact that my Buxton experience had made me understand how powerful it could be when local historians began capturing the stories of how ordinary citizens contributed to the building of their community. And I hope that by finding a kernel of history about each of these communities, or profiling small stories that had already been documented by others but weren't well known, I might inspire more local researchers to continue to pursue this quest. And so I hope to be a catalyst for the creation of course material on the history of blacks that might then be used in Ontario schools. I recognize that no history of blacks in Ontario would be complete without reference to the experience of what were then labeled Negroes or coloreds in the U.S., and the attitude and ideas of the early Ontario settlers had been forged in America, and their Ontario experience influenced the subsequent contributions so many of them made to the United States after the war. By the time I finished, I thought I had a reasonably fascinating proposal, but the Department of History at Western thought otherwise. The general view seemed to be that there was little history about these communities worth telling, and it was Dr. James Tallman, the chief librarian at Western University and a member of the Ontario and Canada Historical Boards, and a close friend of an aging local historian named Fred Landon. It was this Dr. James Tallman who actually saved my project. But let's take a look at Fred Landon. He was an early pioneer in writing Negro history and a prolific writer with more than 153 titles on this topic to his credit. After graduating from Western in 1906, he became a journalist with the London Free Press, and over the years his column, Looking Over Western Ontario, featured, interestingly, many small stories about regional black history. In 1916, he became chief librarian of the London Public Library and devoted himself to amassing an excellent collection of research material about the City of London. As a result, a branch of the city's library was eventually named for him to acknowledge his contributions. He wrote a master's thesis in history in 1919 titled The Relation of Canada to the Anti-Slavery and Abolition Movements in the United States. But I discovered that one of his earliest articles was The Buxton Settlement in Canada, published in the Journal of Negro History in 1918. His last article was The Book That Battled Slavery, and it spotlighted Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so in 2009, the Ontario Historical Society honored Fred Landon by republishing 26 of Fred's key articles in a book known as Ontario's African-Canadian Heritage, The Collected Writings by Fred Landon, 1918 to 1967. In the foreword to that book, Brian Walls, the past president of the Ontario Historical Society, and himself a descendant of the black settlers whose history Fred was devoted to preserving, wrote the following. As a writer, Landon must have been touched by the souls of these ordinary people who yearned to tell their extraordinary tales and who thirsted to feel important, appreciated, and to make a contribution to their new, cold, and distant land called Canada. Walls goes on, I also intuitively feel that after reading his writings, that another reason why Fred Landon was inspired to do such groundbreaking writing is because he had the compassionate soul of a 19th century abolitionist freedom fighter. I'm certain that if he had been born at another time and place, he would have risked his life to help my ancestors and others to freedom. Fred knew that the Underground Railroad was the first great freedom movement in the Americas, and the first time that good people, black and white, and of different races and faiths, worked together in harmony for freedom and justice. So continuing with my background on Fred Landon, I note that in 1923, he became the first full-time librarian at Western University, with a concurrent appointment as lecturer in history and English. He then became the first vice president of Western in 1946 and the first dean of graduate studies in 1947, and he died in 1969. James Tallman, whom I mentioned earlier as saving my project, was Fred's student and eventually his successor as chief university librarian. He shared Fred's beliefs that university librarians should also be scholars, and he shared the belief that the stories of black communities in Canada were worth preserving. And so with him as my champion and thesis advisor, and further backing from Dr. John O'Farrell of King's College, a Catholic affiliate college at Western, the history department at the university reluctantly accepted my thesis proposal. And through Dr. Tallman, I gained the privilege of open access to Fred Landon. And in the last years of his life, Fred honored me by expressing great enthusiasm for my work and providing me with both useful context and welcome encouragement. So let me talk a bit about some of the early scholars of Black Canadian history beyond a person like Fred Landon. I have noted already that for the most part, blacks in Canada had been invisible and neglected by mainstream history. But as I began to dig further, I realized I was not traveling through entirely virgin territory. 19th century abolitionists like Benjamin Drew, in order to influence public opinion in the United States, had been keenly involved in documenting the stories of slaves who were now building successful lives in freedom. Noted names from this period include crusading journalists such as Frederick Douglass, Henry Bibb, the publisher of The Voice of the Fugitive in Upper Canada, and Mary Ann Shadd, publisher of The Provincial Freeman. Anderson Abbott, who served as an officer in the Northern Army during the Civil War, became a leader in the black community in Toronto and played a role in preserving their history. In the first half of the 20th century, however, most of the publications in this field came from the pens of white writers such as Fred Landon at Western and Judge W.R. Riddell of Toronto. The U.S.-based Journal of Negro History, founded in 1960 by Carter Woodson, published most of these articles. Later, a white American scholar, Robin Winks, published the first general survey of Black Canadian history, which went through 12 editions between 1971 and 2004. John O'Farrell of King's College at Western and Alexander Murray of York University in Toronto were also among the white Canadians who began to investigate this neglected piece of our history. And James Walker, based in Dalhousie University, began to publish some exceptional work on the history of the blacks in Nova Scotia, with an initial focus on the black loyalists who came to Canada after the War of Independence. For the most part, this scholarly work was proceeding independently and in ignorance of the efforts of people within the Black Canadian community to collect material about their own heritage and publish pamphlets to educate the general public and future generations. As I had seen in Buxton, local leaders, teachers, librarians, local museum directors in historically black communities were determined to capture and tell the stories of their ancestors. And I've already introduced you to Brian Prince as one of these amazing storytellers. Another such individual was Alvin McCurdy, a good, solid working man, a journeyman carpenter who had been born in Amherstburg, Ontario, and lived his whole life there. He was a Freemason, active in both the Baptist Church and in several anti-discrimination groups. He was also a passionate public historian, genealogist, and collector of black history memorabilia. People warned me in advance that he was also a suspicious man who guarded his collection carefully and would be unlikely to open up to me, a young white teacher. But in fact, Alvin and I became good friends, and on several occasions I stayed in the tiny home of his that doubled as his library and museum of black history. To a casual visitor, it appeared to be an entirely chaotic collection, but amazingly, Alvin could put his hand almost immediately on any bit of information I sought. And after many hours of talk and relationship building, I was granted permission by him to pursue his amazing store of photos, postcards, meeting minutes, correspondence, personal scrapbooks, and newspaper clipping. This collection, which has been described as the largest and most important source of information about the history of the black community in Ontario, was eventually purchased on Alvin's death by the Ontario Archives and is now focused in their new building at York University. The Museum of Black History he helped found in the town of his birth lives on. One of the many people in the Buxton community committed to keeping their past alive was Arlie Robbins. And in 1976, she and a group of local people undertook a research project to explore the history of their village. In Arlie's own words, the intent of this project was to explore the background of this little group of people, the early settlers in Buxton, just scant years and sometimes even scant months or days away from slavery. We had to try to find out several things, among them, who were they? What was it like? Where did they come from? How did they get here? The insights then gained through this short-term research project encouraged Arlie to build on that experience and to write a powerful book on her community entitled Legacy to Buxton. She begins the prologue to this book by stating the following: "The reason for the telling of the Buxton story are many and varied. North Buxton's roots, like the roots of all our race, and indeed, according to recent archaeological discoveries, the roots of all races, are buried deep in the heart of Africa. Though we are far removed by time, distance, and culture from our ancestral homes, the face of Africa is still reflected in our faces. The music and rhythm of Africa is still heard in our voices and felt in our bodies, and the religious doctrines of Africa are still manifested in the secret recesses of our souls. These are undeniable facts. Just as the sun rises in the east, so did our forebears rise in Africa." I only recently learned from one of Arlie's family about the mixed feelings of respect and frustration she had felt with regard to the reality up to the point that she wrote that book. The history of her community was better known by several outsiders, including me and my great friend Vic Ullman of Toledo, than it was by members of the community themselves. Again, quoting from the prologue to her book, Arlie writes, "The story of our Elgin settlement has often been told from the outside in. Now it is time that the story be told from the inside out." So she goes on to indicate that her intention with her book is to tell the story of the people of the settlement, not only the well-known ones, whose accomplishments are already a matter of public record, but also to tell of the others, for the most part unknown, who were really the heart of the settlement and who remained here as the more venturesome left to seek their fortunes elsewhere. She positions her book as a story of her community's survival and declares with a flash of personal passion that so much was part of Arlie. "What thrills my soul, gives me faith, and strengthens my belief in our future is the fact that we have survived. For 300 years we survived, and North Buxton and its people are a vital part of that survival." So these pioneers of Black Canadian history that I mentioned had significant influence on my work. But one individual who taught and mentored me the most during my data gathering for the thesis was Vic Ullman. I believe, in fact, that it was Arlie Robbins who first told me in Buxton I needed to talk to this man in Toledo who was researching the story of the Reverend William King, the Southern white abolitionist and philanthropist who was a major force in the creation of their community. So I got his number and I called Vic on a Friday afternoon about a week later from London, Ontario, and we had a long conversation during which he quizzed me about why was I interested in Buxton, what was I intending to do with my interest. After I told him a little bit more on my background, I told him that I'd very much like to meet with him sometime, and he surprised me then by saying, "So why don't you come now? I'll keep the evening free." Now, Toledo is about a 5-hour drive from London, Ontario, and to the astonishment of my wife and children, I arrived home from the university that afternoon to announce that I was heading to Ohio for the weekend. And once I reached Vic's home, we talked well into the night. And so began another of the wonderful personal and professional relationships that have shaped my life and career. Prior to World War II, Vic had been a New York Times journalist, investigating modern-day slavery in the American South, particularly around the plantation owned by the powerful segregationist Senator Eastland. Arrested on trumped-up charges, Vic was put in a stockade along with black laborers who had resisted Eastland's version of forced contract labor. Always on the lookout for a good story, Vic took advantage of the opportunity while in the stockade to interview his fellow inmates. And when his New York Times employer finally found him and got him released, he used his notes to take the Eastlands to court and win a court case against those seeking to force the laborers into modern-day slavery. Vic had been drawn to Buxton by his interest in the Underground Railroad, and his book, titled Look to the North Star, is still the most complete history available on the founding of the Elgin settlement, which became Buxton. When I first met him, he was semi-retired, writing for the Toledo Blade, teaching journalism at the University of Toledo, and promoting initiatives to link the United States and Canada in the Great Lakes region. He was to become my mentor and a valued critic as I worked on my thesis. And even after he retired from the Blade, I would often pile my box of research papers into the family station wagon and drive the 13 hours to the Ullman's mountaintop in Alstead, New Hampshire, where he had gone to retire and write. I would write all day for 3 or 4 days in those beautiful surroundings, and then at the end of each day subject my writings to the critique of Vic and his working wife partner, Louise. It was Vic who introduced me to the important and powerful Martin Delaney, the African-American abolitionist who was arguably one of the first proponents of black nationalism in the U.S. For a brief period in the 1850s, Delaney lived in Chatham, Ontario, where he provided leadership for the growing Pan-African movement that linked the Buxton model to potential developments in West Africa. In Martin Delaney, The Beginnings of Black Nationalism, Vic paints a portrait of this true Renaissance man who was journalist, editor, doctor, scientist, soldier, inventor, customs inspector, orator, politician, and novelist. A fascinating person. Vic and I became close friends. My family often accompanied me on many of the visits to Ohio and New Hampshire, where my children very much enjoyed being spoiled by this extra set of generous grandparents. And Vic continued to be driven by his passion for telling the Buxton story until his death from cancer in the late 1970s. Vic was an inspiration to the Buxton Museum team and an inspiration to me. Another prominent individual whose work and thinking strongly influenced mine was Dr. Daniel Hill. Dan Sr. was born in Missouri and raised mostly in the western states. He graduated from Howard University after serving in the highly segregated U.S. Army. And he and his wife Donna decided to move into Canada, where in 1960 he did a PhD in sociology at the University of Toronto on the topic Negroes in Toronto, a sociological study of a minority group. The career of Dan Hill Sr. is a history of firsts. In 1962, he was appointed the first director of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the first commission of its kind in Canada. Under Dan's direction, it became a major public agency. In 1973, he left government and established the first human rights consulting firm in Canada. And then, having established himself as a pioneer in human rights, he then went on to become a prominent writer and historian of blacks in Canada. In 1978, Dan and Donna, along with a few close friends, founded the Ontario Black History Society, again, the first of its kind in Canada. In 1981, he published one of the first popular histories in this field, titled The Freedom Seekers, Blacks in Early Canada. Now, to my children's generation, those now in their 40s and 50s, Dan Hill Sr. is best known as the father of singer and songwriter Dan Hill Jr. and of Lawrence Hill, author of the best-selling Book of Negroes as well as 6 earlier books. And when I met his son Lawrence for the first time in 2009 and learned that he had visited West Africa several times as a Crossroads Africa volunteer. Lawrence's The Book of Negroes explores a neglected corner of history as he travels among Africa, UK, US, and Canada, creating a brilliantly imagined piece of historical fiction. It quickly became a bestseller in Canada and has been received well throughout most of the world, and most recently was turned into a powerful television series. My daughter, Chris, as a teenager, was astonished when at a dinner at our place, Dan Sr., after talking to us about his family and praising the writing ability of his young son, Lawrence, began complaining that his other son, Danny, had this crazy idea that he was going to make a living with his guitar. By that time, of course, Dan Jr.'s early song called Sometimes When We Touch was on the charts and was a staple for slow dances at school events. So Danny Jr. was already well known to Chris and her young friends. And she got quite excited to realize that it was Danny Jr.'s father that was at our table. Shortly after that, I met Dan Jr. in the 1950s at the urging of his father. We suspected that his father's intent was that I was to use my educator's influence to urge his guitar-playing son back into serious educational studies. Dan Sr. was a big man with a powerful personality and a drive to succeed. For him, success for blacks would come only through higher education. And I sensed the tension between father and son in conversations with both. Dan Jr.'s 2008 book, not his song, but his book, entitled I Am My Father's Son, was written shortly after his father's death and recounts their emotional journey. I found myself weeping as I read this account and later heard Dan Jr.'s words of respect for his father on the radio. Much of that respect was summarized in the song he wrote and sang at his father's deathbed and later at his memorial. Here are some of the words from that song, My Father's Son. The strongest man I ever knew, I never was a match for you. Always wanted your attention, never knew just how to get it, so I rebelled, tried to be your opposite. I did it well. Strange but true how our lives are like a circle now. I'm so very much like you. You were my unsolved mystery, always barely out of reach. At baseball games when parents came, you were always missing. That's okay. You had your meetings and promotions anyway. Somehow I knew the more I tried to be different, the more I was like you. Memories die hard. Love dies harder still. I forgive you. I have no choice, 'cause when all is said and done, I am my Father's son. What is love without forgiveness? You did the best you could. I let go of the anger when I finally understood. I purchased a copy of that book for each of my children and wrote a covering note explaining why this book and the song that went along with it had touched me so profoundly. I had also been moved by a page-long tribute to his father that the other brother, Lawrence Hill, had written, which was published by the Toronto Star. And I found myself unceasingly trying to imagine what my two boys might say publicly about me after I died. The relationship-building journey between father and son is a complex and challenging one. So let me get back to my PhD thesis. My determination to make my thesis a comprehensive exploration of the 100-plus Black communities in the region did make it a bit of an epic project. Given 7 years to complete it, I ended up submitting it within minutes of the final deadline. Remembering that some historians had told me there were no worthwhile stories to tell about Black history, my thesis ran to over 1,100 pages in 2 volumes. And my daughter Jan, who later in 1989 used a much smaller font in order to bring her English PhD thesis in under the new 300-page limit for thesis, is convinced that it was my weary examiners who must have led the charge to impose page limits on future theses at Western University. It was a difficult thesis defense, as some of the examiners were uncomfortable with my storytelling approach. And I acknowledged their suggestion that it could have been done differently, focusing just on a few big communities, but I tried to explain my reason for doing what I did, and I left the thesis as is in their hands and spent a tense hour outside the room while they deliberated on its fate. To my surprise and delight, a Nigerian graduate student friend joined me and said he had come to offer moral support. He said he knew how difficult it was to experiment with new approaches, particularly if it had anything to do with Africa. Much to my relief, however, the examiners accepted the thesis and my PhD was completed. I subsequently then tried to interest publishers in some parts of it, but consistently got the same answer. The Black population in Canada was so small, they didn't believe there could be any market for these stories. My argument was that these were Canadian stories, human stories of challenge and response, stories of Black people, but not exclusively for Black people. But my arguments fell on deaf ears and no publication was forthcoming. For my part, I still had no doubt that the creative, courageous experiences of those Black immigrants in the 19th century could provide important insights for new generations of Canadians. So I turned all my materials over to the Buxton Museum team and went on to other things, and much had been happening in my life in parallel with the thesis writing that will be the subject of subsequent logbooks. I moved my family to Ghana for a year while I took on the role of West African director for CUSO. On my return, I took a short-term contract working for Roby Kidd at the new Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in Toronto. And Roby was one of Canada's noted experts in adult education, known around the world for his creative leadership in literacy and distance learning in developing countries. And after several false starts, I succeeded in convincing Western to set up an Office of International Education, of which I became the first executive director. But while I was out of the country, much had also been happening in Buxton. The museum opened in 1967, and Vic and Louise Ullman attended the celebration while I was still in Canada. The museum was recognized as a National Historic Site in 1999. And many years later, thanks to the efforts of Paul Lovejoy at the Tubman Center and Brian Prince of the Buxton Museum, the Africa World Press finally published my thesis, now titled Under the North Star: Black Communities in Upper Canada Before Confederation. This led me to a renewed connection with the Buxton community, and when I attended the Buxton Labor Day celebrations in 2007, I was thrilled and proud when several authors of local history books all told me that my work had been their inspiration and starting point for telling the stories of their own community, and that had been my great hope. Let me turn for a moment towards the end of our story for today and a look at African Canadian historiography. Unless you have subjected yourself to a PhD study in history, the term historiography is not likely one you're familiar with, but it's worth a moment to reflect on that term as it related to telling the stories of the experience of African Canadians. A commonly accepted definition describes the term in this manner: historiography is the study of the way history has been and is written. It is the history of historical writing. When you study historiography, you do not study the events of the past directly, but rather the changing interpretation of those events in the works of individual historians. Clearly, then, the history of Canadian Blacks would be influenced by the worldview, perspectives, indeed personal bias of those writing the stories, underpinned by the dominant values of their community. I have indicated that beginning in the 19th century, a body of literature on those African Canadian experiences had been created by both members of the community and by thoughtful white analysts such as Fred Landon. Yet for most of our history, few Canadians have been exposed to these stories in school, in the media, in literature, or in public cultural exhibits. Peggy Bristow and colleagues in a 1994 publication argues, and I quote, "The educational Canadian system has maintained and perpetuated the common perception that Black people were either non-existent in the development of Canada or only arrived in Canada through recent migration from the Caribbean and Africa." End of quote. I am happy, though, to speak of signs of an awakening of interest in the African Canadian experiences. Since 1975, there's been some encouraging developments and an increased level of interest in African Canadian stories by researchers, writers, publishers, artists, and granting agencies. And we will pick up on some of these developments throughout several of the remaining stories from later logbooks. But here again, our story about the awakening of interest in African American experiences begins in the United States, which had incredible impact not only on Black-white relationship in that country, but on attitudes and awareness in Canada and in many other countries. And I want to speak about the publication of a book called Roots by Haley in 1976. The publication of Roots once again demonstrated the power of the written word. Not since the publication in the mid-19th century of Uncle Tom's Cabin had a book exerted such impact on people in both the black and white communities. The book and its following television series sparked a phenomenon of black self-discovery, but it also had a powerful effect on other communities and individuals. I remember vividly, for example, how in my class at the Aldous College of Education, the students undertook to review and reflect on each segment of the Roots TV series and took it on as a personal homework obligation. Their enthusiasm for the program meant I had to find time the next day in class for the outburst of positive comments, questions, and expressed confusion about the historical realities that were being displayed. Roots, interestingly, appeared in the bicentennial of the American Revolution and in the year that Black History Week in the United States was officially extended into Black History Month. It demonstrated again the power of skillful telling of a people's odyssey through the swamp of lost racial links to the more solid ground of shared connections. Michael Eric Dyson, in the new introduction to a 30th anniversary edition of Roots, provides better insights than I could of the power of this book. He argues that it has become one of the nation's seminal texts. In his words, a literary North Star that guided us through the long midnight of slavery's haunting presence. Let me quote an extensive excerpt from Michael Dyson in the introduction to that anniversary edition of Roots. From the very beginning, Alex Haley's Roots counted as much more than a mere book. It tapped deeply into the Black American hunger for an African ancestral home that had been savaged by centuries of slavery and racial dislocation. More than the sum of its historical and literary parts, some of which have been rigorously criticized and debunked, Haley's quest for his roots changed the way black folk thought about themselves and how white America viewed them. No longer were we genealogical nomads with little hope of learning the names and identities of the people from whose loins and culture we sprang. Haley wrote Black Folk into the Book of American Heritage and gave us the confidence to believe that we could find our forebears even as he shared his own. Kunta and Kizzy and Chicken George, too, became members of our Black American family. That's why no flaw or shortcoming in Haley's tome could dim the brilliant light he shed on the black soul. Haley's monumental achievement helped convince the nation that the black story is the American story. He also made it clear that black humanity is a shining beacon that miraculously endured slavery's brutal horrors. A powerful piece by Michael Dyson, who makes the case that the true impact of Haley's book is that it started a conversation about black roots that continues to this day. Our interest in a subsequent excerpt from one of my logbooks will be to identify the extent to which a conversation on black roots was also appearing in Canada, and to say something about the progress being made in writing the contribution of African Canadians into our Canadian heritage. I want to move to close with a provocative and entertaining recent contribution to the literature in Canada in an unusual, serious publication by my good friend Phil Fraser. I came to know Phil through our common interest in the Banff Centre, and Phil has made his mark in filmmaking, radio, and television. He's the former director of Telefilm Canada and first CEO of Vision TV, or early CEO of Vision TV. He's also known as a human rights activist, as he was the former Chief Commissioner of the Alberta Human Rights Commission. But in 2009, Phil wrote a book entitled How the Blacks Created Canada. 400 years of remarkable stories. How the Blacks Created Canada. And here Phil's book brought attention to the achievements of many Black Canadians whose contribution to Canada's economic and cultural development have been incredibly positive, but seldom recognized. And I was so proud to be asked by Phil to write the following introduction in this publication. And let me share my words with you now from that book, How the Blacks Created Canada. At any time in the last half of the 20th century, a book with this title would have been met with disbelief at best and at worst derision. The conventional wisdom for some time has been that there was no significant history of the Black communities in Canada worth telling. With this book that features a selection of intriguing profiles of outstanding Black Canadians, the author has presented us with a powerful challenge to that old limited perspective. Building on efforts undertaken over the years by a small band of writers, librarians, academics, public historians, and modern-day griots, who are the African keepers of oral history. Building on the efforts of that diverse group to keep these stories alive, Phil Fraser has offered us an intriguing and unusual gift. It is a gift that provides readers with easy access to important aspects of our country's history, about which most Canadians have been, for the most part, completely unaware. It is a gift that has the potential to stimulate some fundamental shifts in our personal perceptions about our country and about its ongoing difficult efforts to create a prosperous, inclusive, caring, and truly multicultural society. It is a gift also full of exciting surprises about the role of members of the various Black communities in the development of Canada in the more than 400 years that they have been part of our mosaic. While acknowledging that the stories of these Black communities have often been ones of trials and tribulations, the author's special contribution is to present us with powerful stories covering the period from 1600 to the present of outstanding leadership by Black Canadians. And he invites us to celebrate these achievements and to draw on them for inspiration in our own lives. The gift is a timely one. It will understandably be welcomed by members of the present-day African Canadian communities who are eager to know their own particular stories. It will also be welcomed by educators, by community leaders, by museum directors, and by social activists and policymakers who are eager to strengthen a full awareness of our diverse history and the behaviors and actions needed to create harmonious communities out of this diversity. It will be welcomed as well by anyone who is hungry for inspirational stories of leadership that demonstrate evidence of courage, resilience, discipline, creativity, and respect for others in building sustainable communities. In that sense, then, it's a gift for all Canadians and a gift for all ages. We are indebted to Phil Fraser for this precious gift. Let the journey continue.